Hi Seagull class. Today I'm going to read chapter 12 from our book Harriet the Spy by Louise Fitzhugh. The next morning she arrived very early at the school and was writing furiously in the notebook when they all filed in. They had been chattering excitedly among themselves, but they all stopped when they saw her. She continued to write with renewed zeal until Miss Elson came in. She stood up with the others, but then sat down and wrote some more. When Miss Elson handed back the test papers from the day before, she didn't look up, but just continued writing. Every now and then she would glance meaningfully at one of the others to let them know that at that very moment she was writing about that person. They all watched her nervously. Actually, she was doing nothing of the kind. She had begun to write a series of memories, starting with the first thing she could remember at all, which was standing up in her crib, looking out the window at the park, and shouting with every ounce of her breath. She was writing a later memory. I remember when we lived at 77th and 5th. I had to ride the school bus every day instead of walking. There was a very nasty boy who lived in the next apartment. I was 7 and he was 3. His name was Carter Wingfield and he burped all the time. He was so nasty looking that I pinched him once when his mother wasn't looking. My mother didn't know it was me that pinched him, but old Golly knew, and she let me have it good for that. She said even if he was the nastiest thing I ever saw in my life, I should just think about that to myself and not do anything to him because he couldn't help his nastiness. She looked around the room. Apprehensive glances came her way now and then. Otherwise, nothing was happening. She wrote, "Can they help what they're doing? I wish I knew what old Golly would think of this. I have to know what she thinks. How can I find out? I think she would say that they could help it because they're trying to control me and make me give up the notebook. And she always said that people who try to control people and change people's habits are the ones that make all the trouble. If you don't like somebody, walk away," she said, "but don't try and make them like you." I think she would hate this whole thing. She looked up and saw everyone starting his work. She took out a piece of paper, feeling listless and bored as she did. She started to write her name at the top of the page, but it didn't seem like any fun. She looked around at everyone. Most people weren't looking at her, but the ones who were, Marian and Rachel in particular, had nasty looks on their faces. She looked back at the paper and gave up trying to take an interest in her own name and went back to writing in her notebook. Miss Elson's harsh voice finally reached her. "Harriet, you're not paying attention at all." Harriet looked up and saw everyone looking at her with contempt. They're thinking, just what you'd expect of her, she thought to herself. She put the notebook under the desk on her knees where Miss Elson couldn't see it. Whenever Miss Elson turned to the blackboard, Harriet looked under and wrote a little. "That Pinky Whitehead is the most disgusting thing I ever saw. What must his mother have thought the first time she looked at him? She must have thrown up." During math class, she wrote all the time. Everyone was bent over their work, and Miss Harris, the math teacher, was too old to get up and walk around and look. Harriet got so involved she didn't even think where she was. She didn't, in fact, even hear the bell. From far away, she heard someone saying, "Harriet, oh Harriet," and then, "Harriet Welsh," suddenly, very loudly. She almost fell off her chair. She looked up, and the room was empty, except for old Miss Harris, who was looking at her with the meanest look that she had ever seen on a teacher. Harriet stared back at her, terrified. Miss Harris stood up. "It's time to go home, Harriet. But before you go, I think you had better show me what has kept you so entranced during math class." She advanced slowly towards Harriet. Harriet could see her bony, claw-like hand, covered with brown spots, reaching. Harriet got up so fast she knocked her chair over. She caught sight of Miss Harris reeling backward away from her as she made such a great leap for the door that she might have been pole vaulting. Miss Harris gasped, and her hand flew to her throat. But Harriet was out and gone, hugging her notebook, running for her life. The next day was even worse. She didn't make any pretense of doing her work. She just wrote all the time. Miss Elson spoke to her 4 times, and Miss Harris yelled 3 times and then gave up. At the end of the day, she went straight home, had her cake and milk, and then took her notebook over to the park and sat on a bench. She found that she enjoyed writing under the trees. "I have heard that pigeons make people get cancer, so I will stay away from them. On the other hand, they are pretty. I like to look at the mayor's house. It is a nice white house. Once my daddy told me that there were a lot of houses like that, all up and down the river. But then they made a park and they threw away all the houses. They should have left some old haunted ones for children to go and play in. I would have locked Pinky in the basement until his hair turned white. I like the tugboats. I don't have anyone to play with. I don't even have anyone to talk to now. They got rid of old Golly. I'm going to finish up these memoirs and sell them to the Book of the Month selection. And then my mother will get the book in the mail as a surprise. Then I will be so rich and famous that people will bow in the streets and say, 'There goes Harriet M. Welsh. She is very famous.' Rachel Hennessy will plots." Harriet looked up when she heard the toot-toot of a toy whistle. She raised her eyebrows at what she saw. They were making a parade along the river. The boy with the purple socks, now wearing green socks, walked in front carrying the flagpole with the purple socks attached. There was a rat-a-tat-tat from a toy drum that Pinky Whitehead was beating, and behind them there was a squadron formed by Rachel Hennessy, Marion Hawthorne, Carrie Andrews, Laura Peters, Beth Ellen, and Sport and Janie. They marched in formation like a platoon, and when they turned, Harriet could see a sign attached to Beth Ellen's back, which said, "This parade, the courtesy of the Spycatcher Club." Harriet sat frozen, watching them march up and down. She was afraid to move because they might see her. Her worst fears were realized a moment later when Marion Hawthorne gave a big blast on the whistle and gestured frantically. 9 heads turned in Harriet's direction. Harriet stiffened. They were going to march right past her. They turned into the lane sedately. Harriet didn't know what to do. She felt that if she showed any reaction at all, it would please them too much. On the other hand, if she showed no reaction at all, when a whole parade was marching right under her nose, they would know that they had affected her. She sat stiffly on her bench. It was horribly embarrassing. It seemed to take about an hour for them to come towards her, and then they were passing right in front of her. As they went past, she felt like General Eisenhower reviewing the troops. It took everything she had not to salute. When they got close, she saw that the boy with the purple socks wore a sign around his neck, which said, "Ask to be told, the legend of the purple socks, 10 cents. When they were directly opposite of her, all stuck their tongues out in unison, as though they had practiced, and Pinky gave an extra little roll to the drum. They marched away. Would they come back around? Harriet opened her notebook. Well, that's not my fault. I never told him to wear, or not wear, purple socks. He should have kept on wearing purple socks. Some people act like a martyr at the drop of a hat, or a sock, ha ha. I hear them coming back. I think I will go home. Harriet walked casually away from the bench. When she saw they were coming around again, she dove under a bush until they marched past. Then she went home, went up to her room, and closed the door. Well, I just won't go to the park anymore. That's nothing. Who wants to go there? It's full of idiots walking around in parades. I can write in my notebook just as well as sitting on my bed. I don't care about their dumb old club anyway, if all they're going to do is march around a lot. There was a knock at the door, and when Harriet said, "What?" her mother entered. "Harriet, I've got to talk to you. I've just come back from your school. Miss Elson called me up this afternoon and said that I'd better come over and have a talk with you." Harriet's throat closed up. "There's nothing to be afraid of. She just wanted to talk about your schoolwork. She says that for the last week, you haven't done any at all. What about it?" "I haven't anything to say." "What do you mean? Did you do your work or not?" "No, I don't think so. I can't remember." "Harriet, these are very unsatisfactory answers. Is something else bothering you?" "No." Harriet's mother pulled the chair over to the bed, sat down, and stared at Harriet. "What have you got there?" "What?" Harriet looked around innocently. "You know perfectly well what. Is that the same notebook?" "No, a different one." "You know what I mean, Harriet. Are you still writing down mean things about people?" "No, I'm writing my memoirs." Her mother, for some reason or other, laughed. She then smiled warmly at Harriet. "Both Miss Elson and Miss Harris say that you do nothing whatever anymore, but write in that notebook. Is that right?" "Yes." "They say that I must take it away from you, or you will never learn anything." "I'm learning plenty." "What are you learning?" "Everything about everybody." Mrs. Welsh consulted a small slip of paper. "History, geography, French, science, all bad. You're even doing badly in English. And we know you can't add or subtract." Harriet just sat there. School seemed a million miles away, a moon that she had been to once. I'm afraid that you're only going to be able to play with this notebook after school, but not during school hours." "I'm not playing. Who says I'm playing? I'm working." "Look, dear, at the moment you're in school, so your work is school. Just like your father works at the office, you work at school. School work is your work. What do you do?" A lot of unseen, unappreciated things. That's not the point. At the moment, your work is going to school and learning, and you're not doing that. Now, you can have the notebook as soon as you come home from school. I'll give it to the cook, and you can have it just as soon as you come in." "No," said Harriet. "Yes, now that's definite." "I'll throw a tantrum." "So throw, but I'm not going to stand here and watch you. Now, in the morning, I don't want to see you leaving here with any notebook, nor are you to arrive at school with one. Miss Elson is going to check." Harriet lay flat on her stomach on the bed. She pushed her face into the pillow. "Honey, is something bothering you?" "No," came out very muffled. Chapter 13. The next morning, Harriet was frisked by her mother. The notebook was taken away and given to the cook, who looked as though she might eat it. Harriet walked sadly to school. She dragged her feet and looked intently at the cracks in the cement. She dragged in the door, up the steps, and into her homeroom. She sat down and stared at the floor, not hearing anything around her. After Miss Elson had come in and they had said good morning to her, she went immediately to Harriet and made her stand up to be searched, then searched her desk. Harriet submitted limply. When no notebook was found, Miss Elson patted Harriet on the head like a good puppy and went back to her desk in the front. Some very interested eyes watched this whole procedure. When it was finished, everyone snickered. They whispered a lot and stared at Harriet, who stared at the floor. Harriet did her work. She didn't care anymore about signing her name, and she got no pleasure from the work that she did, but she did it. Everything bored her. She found that when she didn't have a notebook, it was hard for her to think. The thoughts came slowly, as though they had to squeeze through a tiny door to get to her. Whereas when she wrote, they flowed out faster than she could put them down. She sat very stupidly with a blank mind until finally, "I feel different," came slowly into her head. She sat digesting the thought like a Thanksgiving dinner. "Yes," she thought after a long pause. And then, after more time, "mean. I feel mean." She looked around with a mean look for everyone. Nobody saw her. She felt her face contorting. It was an impressive moment that everyone missed. It was a moment that Harriet would never forget. When the bell rang for lunch, it was as though she didn't have to think anymore. Everything happened as though she had planned it, but she really hadn't. For example, when the bell rang, Pinky Whitehead jumped up and ran down the aisle. Harriet put her foot out, and he fell flat on his face. A terrific wail went up from his prone body, and when he raised his face, his nose was bleeding. Harriet looked extremely blank. Inside, she felt a sense of very personal satisfaction. She got up and walked quietly out, stepping delicately over Pinky's writhing body. She knew no one would ever think of her because she had never done anything like that in her life. She went and got her tomato sandwich. During lunch, she sat owl-eyed by herself. She felt her thoughts limping like crippled children. When the bell rang again, she rose like a robot and walked to the door. She was pushed helplessly into the crush at the door. Carrie Andrews was right in front of her. Without a thought, Harriet pinched her expertly on the leg. Carrie let out a terrible scream and looked around with a wild red flush on her face. Harriet looked solidly ahead. No one would think of her because she had never pinched anyone in her life. Carrie Andrews, as a matter of fact, sometimes pinched, but the only one really known for pinching was Marion Hawthorne. Carrie leaned over and hit Marion in the head, even though Marion was 4 people away and couldn't possibly have pinched her. A large fight started, and Harriet squeezed her way out and into math class. She sat looking Miss Harris forlornly in the eye while the others filed in. Miss Harris, after making certain that Harriet had no notebook, tried to smile warmly at her, but Harriet looked away. Without a notebook, there was nothing to do but listen to Miss Harris. Having never done this before, Harriet was totally lost. Miss Harris went on and on about some bridge. Everyone copied down a lot of numbers. Harriet copied them down too, but they made absolutely no sense. They went from there into a spirited discussion about buying and selling a lot of lamb chops. Harriet wadded up a piece of paper and, again, without thought, sent it flying into Sport's ear. Sport gave a little yelp, but recovered quickly. At his next opportunity, he looked around. Harriet shot him a mean look. He stared at her a minute, his eyes wide with growing perplexity and fear, and then he looked away quickly. There was in process an incomprehensible discussion about boats and how many knots they went. Harriet tried to think, but it was impossible. She quite abruptly threw a pencil straight into Beth Ellen's face. Beth Ellen looked horror-struck, and when she saw Harriet looking at her, burst into loud, ridiculous baby tears. The bell rang, and as Miss Harris scuttled over to Beth Ellen, Harriet walked to the door and down the steps. She ran home into her house, down the steps, and bang, right into the cook. How can you do it every day? Do they aim you from school right at me? Give me my notebook, please. What notebook? What do you mean? My notebook. My notebook. Harriet had a moment of sheer panic. Listen to me. You apologize for almost knocking me to the floor. The cook stood, hands on hips, as though she had all the time in the world. I apologize. All right. She turned her back in a grumpy way and stuck her hands back into the dishwasher. My notebook, Harriet shouted. Oh, all right, all right. Can't you just wait 1 minute until I get this soap off my hands? No, I can't wait. I want it now. All right, all right. She washed her hands, dried them, and reached down under the sink. From way back in the back, she pulled out the notebook with a little cleanser spilled on it. Harriet grabbed it and ran out of the room. Hey, how about your cake and milk? Harriet didn't even hear. She ran into her room and flung herself on the bed. She lay quietly for a minute, looking reverently at her notebook, and then opened it. She had had an unreasonable fear that it would be empty, but there was her handwriting, reassuring if not beautiful. She grabbed up the pen and felt the mercy of her thoughts coming quickly, zooming through her head and out the pen onto the paper. What a relief, she thought to herself. For a moment, I thought I had dried up. She wrote a lot about what she felt, relishing the joy of her fingers gliding across the page, the sheer relief of communication. After a while, she sat back and began to really think hard. Then she wrote, "Something is definitely happening to me. I'm changing. I don't feel like me at all. I don't ever laugh or think anything funny. I just feel mean all over. I would like to hurt each one of them in a special way that would hurt only them." And she made the list. Marion Hawthorne, frogs, put one in her desk. A snake would be better. Rachel Hennessy, her father, ask her where he went. Laura Peters, her hair, cut it off, or make a bald spot. Pinky Whitehead, mean looks, that's all he needs. Carrie Andrews, tell her father something terrible about her, which is a lie. Beth Ellen Hansen, hates to be hit, hit her. Janie, break her little finger. Sport, call him a sissy and tell everyone he reads cookbooks. Boy with the purple socks, ? She couldn't think of anything for him because he was so dull. Well, she thought, I will watch him tomorrow. The next day at school, Harriet concentrated on these things. She thought about them so hard that she didn't do her work at all. The only words she spoke all day were when she asked Rachel Hennessy why she didn't have a father living in the house. Actually, what she said was, "You don't have a father, do you, Rachel?" in a fairly conversational tone. Rachel looked at her, horrified, and yelled, "I do too." Harriet said briskly, "Oh, no you don't." "I do too," Rachel shouted. "Well, he doesn't love you." "He does too." "Well, then why doesn't he live with you?" And Rachel burst into tears. The next day she went to the park immediately after breakfast. She looked for a long time in the bushes and finally found a frog. It was a very small frog, maybe a baby. She picked him up very carefully so as not to squash him and put him in the pocket of her jumper. Then she ran to school, keeping her hand lightly around him so that he couldn't jump out. She ran to her homeroom and lifted the top of Marion Hawthorne's desk. Then she carefully put the frog down inside. The frog hopped once and stared up at her peevishly. She stared back at him. She had grown rather fond of him, and she hoped nothing happened to him in the confusion. Well, you'll have to find out tomorrow what happens when Marion opens her desk. If the frog will still be in there or not. You know, Harriet has this notebook where she says that she writes just what happens, but really it seems like she writes mostly mean things about people or ways to be mean to them. But what if you had a notebook where you wrote nice things about people? Things that you noticed that they did, that you admired, or compliments that you would give them, or nice things that you could do for them. You know, I have a notebook like that at school where each page has a name of a child in our class. And on that page, whenever I see people doing good things in class, I write it down on their page so that I have a notebook full of all the wonderful things that all of the children in our class do, including you. Maybe you would like to do that for your family while you're at home this time. You can watch them, and when you notice them do something really nice or really good, you can write it down on their page. I hope you have fun.